Well, here's some research that I've been doing with...
Can you speak really well?
Yep, okay, with Patrice. And what we're looking at is the vegetable and potato processing industry in northwest Tasmania. And I've just put up this map to show where Tasmania is, and the area that we're looking at is this area on the left-hand, or my left-hand side of the map, where it's got two little aeroplanes going in. So northwest Tasmania has about 100,000 people, which is about 20% of Tasmania's population. It's got a number of population centres, Devonport with about 25,000 people, which is closer to the middle, and Smithton on the far tip, which has got about 3,500 people, and in between is Ulverston with about 13,000 people, and that's where our factories are. Tasmania's isolated, it's quite disadvantaged with high levels of unemployment and low levels of educational attainment and low levels of labour market participation. It's also deindustrialised. It started in the 1920s with hydro-industrialisation, and that forced along industrialisation. But as you can see from this slide here, a lot of those industries have now closed. So why are we interested in this deindustrialised region? Well, it still does have some industry, and also in this region unions have had quite a long and strong history. And I suppose more recently in the literature often it talks about, I suppose, transnational campaigns by unions or transnational cooperation. But here we want to look at how and if unions have been able to use the local and place in their campaigns. So what remains in northwest Tasmania is the dairy industry, but also in a sense what's left is the vegetable and potato processing industry. And here's a picture of Simplot's plant in Devonport, which used to be the former Ovaltine factory. So if you ever have drunk Ovaltine as a child like I did, I'm sure you found it more attractive than packets of vegetables. Okay, so the main, I suppose the larger of the two companies, or in northwest Tasmania terms that we're looking at, is Simplot, and there's some details about it. So at Devonport it processes vegetables, and at Ulverston it processes potatoes, mainly into potato chips, both for the supermarket under its own brands and supermarket brands, but also for companies such as McDonald's with their French fries. So the other company there is McCain, a Canadian company. It has just a potato processing plant in Smithton, having closed its vegetable processing plant there a few years ago, and again it produces the same sort of potato chips. Okay, so getting on, I suppose what we've seen in the slides I've looked at so far is about that Tasmania is quite a small economy, and its isolation makes it quite vulnerable to capital's mobility. And again, the decisions that were made to close down those plants weren't made locally, they were made in Canada and the US. So I suppose in a sense what we're interested in is that when you have these regions that are small and isolated, people generally have quite close communities, and about how unions and people try and often bring their action down to the local and into the communities where they live, and I suppose they have social reproduction, where they have greater control. But also the companies, especially in something like vegetable processing or potatoes, where obviously they are grown in the ground, they also depend on their local relationships too, and about how when they disrupt those relationships they can be quite costly to the company. But in areas affected by deindustrialisation, often what can happen is that the community become quite anxious about I suppose economic development, and can often project their anxiety onto targets other than the company. Even though it's the company that makes the decision to actually move, often their anxiety is projected onto the workers. So in that context, trade union demands can be seen as, in effect, affecting local prosperity and creating divisions between the union and the community. Okay, so we'll move on to our first study, which is about McCain, and they're at Smithton. They closed their vegetable processing plant in 2010. And part of this, and in the aftermath, what they did was in effect alienate the farmers. They took quite an aggressive approach. The farmers had grown vegetables. They weren't growing vegetables. They invested in equipment to grow potatoes. So they were often left with equipment that had been used to grow vegetables. They invested in equipment to grow potatoes. McCain said, we want to drive the price down, and said, here's our price and you can take it or leave it. And the farmers often said, well, we'll leave it. So they now were having difficulty sourcing their potatoes and had to get them from a long way away. They'd changed management, and their local management was now seen as locally born and bred. So they'd had quite difficult collective bargaining in more recent years, and I'll return to that a bit later. So how was McCain viewed in the community? We interviewed union delegates, and they were sort of a bit, I suppose, ambivalent about how they were treated. They said McCain was sort of seen a bit quite positively, but then they said, well, the memory of how they treated the farmers was still quite strong. At the same time, how the union was viewed was in a bit of an ambivalent way too. In quite a poor region, these workers were seen as overpaid and having too much time off. In a sense, what the union, though, was able to do quite well at times around their EB campaigns was to engage with the community. So they put up posters saying how the town depended on their wages and for their prosperity, and that seemed to find some resonance, even shopkeepers putting it up in their windows. And of course, shopkeepers aren't often known as being the most radical people. And the union got on the front foot and appeared in the media. As well, what the union tried to do was build solidarity between sites, and some of that was done in a very local way. Like one of the delegates at Smithton said how he had his car serviced by one of the delegates from McCain at Ulverston, and they talked about what was going on in the industry. So I'll see here, I suppose, what we've got here is how the union had been under a lot of pressure. There'd been the threat of closure, then they had the threat of closure of the potato plant with a sort of beauty contest between another plant in South Australia. It closed eventually, but all of this was used to try and, in a sense, roll back conditions or not pay an awful lot. In 2014, I think the union took quite an unprecedented approach of taking or just balloting for industrial action, and this was seen as quite a shock to management, so they reached agreement quite quickly. So this threat of militancy, I suppose, and production pressure as well. They had huge numbers of potatoes they wanted to process, and they didn't want that to take much longer. So the outcomes were that casualisation's a huge issue for them. They achieved a wage increase, they got rid of some of the casualisation, and they got close to 100% membership out of that. So Simplot is a little bit different. It's running at capacity too. The potato processing plant is doing up to 60 containers of chips every 24 hours, which seems like an awful lot of chips to me. They take quite a lot of hostile approach, and that's attributed to their American management and also the fact that their management isn't really local. It comes from manufacturing and particularly the mining industry, which in Australia is known as being quite aggressive. They also, Simplot management had formed I suppose in a sense, a sort of rather ad hoc alliance with local politicians. And Jackie Lambie, who was rather, what would you call it? She doesn't take a consistent line, talked about how she would not stand by silently and allow selfish, reckless and unreasonable demands destroy a successful food processing industry and thousands of direct and indirect jobs. The union actually believes that the ads in the paper were paid for by Simplot. They actually then met with her afterwards, and she said that she'd actually been misled by the company. So Simplot is seen as driven relentlessly by cost, and the fact is that their local management aren't actually from the region, is also seen by the union as being influencing the way that they deal with the union. So they've got significant levels of casualisation that they actually wanted to deal with. They were quite, I suppose, the last EB where they had that political intervention and the media campaign, the delegates said, we got our pants pulled down pretty bad, I thought, which was, I suppose, union talk for things didn't go very well for them. So what they were trying to do now was to reframe the campaign to be not about money, because they're seen as overpaid, but to be about conditions and fairness. Okay, so here we have this ambivalence between the union and the community. On the one hand, they're seen as being greedy and overpaid, and that their demands are going to get Simplot broke, and with that will be the loss of jobs from the region. But at the same time, they feel this sense of, or at least the union organiser did, about being quite embedded in the community. But on the other hand, when the union approached a sporting club to sponsor them, the sporting club turned them down because that was seen as being political rather than, in a sense, community-based. So where does this leave us? Well, in a sense, McCain and Simplot seem to have both disrupted their local relationships with the farmers, and in a sense that sort of disruption seems to have flowed on a little bit into the community. But I suppose the union has quite an ambivalent relationship with the community. So it's seen as being, they're seen as being overpaid, but in another sense, the community is also seen as quite dependent on their salaries. So the union demands are seen as affecting local prosperity, and how the union has tried to do that is to reframe the debate as not being about their salaries, but as being about fairness. I suppose in a sense too there's been divisions between the union and the community, which the Smithton workers seem to have been able to overcome to some degree by putting up posters and doing things such as that, whereas the Simplot workers said, well, we thought about putting up posters, but we haven't actually sort of got round to it. They seem to have been quite, I suppose, almost intimidated by the community backlash to their campaigns. All right, well, I'll just finish there with a picture of northwest Tasmania and all those potatoes growing. They're ready to be turned into French fries.